It took me 20 years, but I finally got around to reading Fitzpatrick's War, written by Theodore Judson. And it has some interesting things going on. It's the story of the rise and fall of a dictator, told from the perspective of one of his close associates, though one who is often sent away from the centers of power and who sees things from an outside perspective more often than not. But what most grabbed me about it is that it's structured like a historical memoir that is heavily annotated by a regime-lackey revisionist historian decades later. It constantly plays with the reliability of self-serving primary sources like memoirs versus scholarly analysis in a wider context, and not always reflecting well on the latter. It reminds us that while the overtness and conscious intent varies greatly, all historical writing serves an agenda. Rarely is it just propaganda, but there's always an underlying conclusion being pushed, which is why I always advise reading historians you disagree with. Fitzpatrick's War is told through the lens of that kind of argument. So the premise is that at some point in the 21st century, a network of satellites emitting powerful electromagnetic storms rendered all electrical equipment useless. Modern civilization collapsed. A whole lot of people died in wars, plagues, and famines. Now, 400 years later, the world has been rebuilt. In some ways, the technology is more advanced, in medicine and material science, for example, just nothing electric. There are steam-powered aircraft, cargo is moved by zeppelins, mechanical contrivances have filled the void of electronics. It's steampunk without the punk. The characters are citizens of the Yukon Confederacy, which by this point has grown to encompass pretty much the entire Anglosphere. Why Yukons, you ask? They were first called the New Agrarians, which was an organization founded in 2018 by a North American farmer named Harold Barr, sir. Why were they called Yukons, and what else can you tell us of the early Yukons? The name was originally an insult, sir. There were professional joke-tellers. I momentarily struggled to recall the ancient word. Comedians, they were called. They said the New Agrarians were so rural they were from the Yukon. The Yukons are generally a religious people, a sort of militant offshoot of American Protestant traditions, and they use this faith to partly justify their warlike ways. God's chosen and all that. Our narrator, Robert Bruce, lowborn but recipient of a knighthood, is a gifted student at the military academy when he is brought into the entourage of Isaac Prophet Fitzpatrick. Yes, his middle name is Prophet. A dashing young nobleman, son of the current consul, and widely considered to be destined for the top spot himself. Fitzpatrick, Fitz to his friends, is accumulating his inner circle even then, deliberately cultivating people that bring necessary skills or qualities. Fitz has a plan. And it's during this period that Robert is introduced to Charlotte, his future wife. She comes on very strong in this scene. It works in this instance, being part of a political setup and illustrating just how prudish that culture can be through Robert's reactions. Fitz doesn't think much of her, but other forces are conspiring to pair Robert and Charlotte. See, Robert is being groomed for a future role by opposing forces, placing him in a bind with Fitz and Charlotte, his best friend and his wife, as poles pulling his loyalty in opposite directions. While Fitz's overtures are quite clear, the other side is a slower burn. As part of the academy exams, the students are called out in assembly and asked a series of questions. Some get easy topics, some get tough ones. Robert gets a somewhat odd question from Dr. Murray, one of the senior professors. What I want to ask you, Sir Robert, is this. Do you think the Yukons of the storm times brought on themselves an everlasting shame? They certainly have some sordid chapters in their past, forced relocations, wars of conquest, deliberate famines. The questioning turns into quite a grilling, with Robert not wanting to give a definitive answer and Dr. Murray attacking the issue from different angles. Do you fall short of God's grace, Sir Robert? He asked me. Without a doubt I do, sir. I do too, said Murray. Are you ashamed of your shortcomings, Sir Robert? Again, I do not know if we are using the right words, sir, I said, and paused to wipe the perspiration from my face. I would rather say, I think regret is the word I want to use. I regret I fall short of God's grace. I regret the early Yukons did the same. Regret? Well, that is a start, Sir Robert, he said, and softly repeated the word to himself. Upon reflection, he said, I think there is a certain promise in regret. Yes, I think it will do for now. And you will do, Sir Robert. It's an exchange carrying much more weight than it seems at the time. Dr. Murray is part of a guild, the Timermen, so named because of their reliance on mechanical timepieces for automated machinery rather than electronics. They also built the storm machines that knocked the world out of the electrical age. They're technocrats with a tempered wisdom about them, but also a coldly nefarious undertone. The book, a historical memoir written by Robert, is constantly interrupted by Dr. Professor Roland Modesty Van Buren with copious footnotes about why Robert is wrong, lying, and of low moral character, often citing the work of a renowned Yukon historian, Dr. Gerald. Dr. Gerald worked within a great university system. His work was vetted and fact-checked by other members of his faculty, and his book underwent peer review immediately before its publication, as happens to all true history texts. The narrative of the story is Fitz's rise to power, his elimination of rivals, his struggle to believe he's a good man doing God's work even as he launches a war that kills millions, and finally his downfall. But the meta-narrative is this historical conversation that, did I really just say that shit? It gets into the grittiness of historical study by addressing the questions of determining reliability of sources, how trustworthy are primary sources in any given situation. Memoirs are always self-serving to some extent and shouldn't be read as objective and accurate accounts, but researched secondary sources can be just as bad. In this case, Robert Bruce takes the Albert Speer approach of framing himself as largely detached from the atrocities of the regime he served, a builder of things rather than a killer of men, close friend of the dear leader who still didn't know the full extent of the horrors being committed until it was too late. It's an argument that Dr. Van Buren eviscerates in his footnotes, sometimes with arguments, but sometimes merely by appealing to authority. For example, regarding one of the many accusations made by Bruce of Fitz's nefarious activities on his rise to power, Gerald points out that the Senate investigated similar charges against the Fitzpatricks in 2410 and found them innocent on all counts, and Gerald is the authoritative text. Much later in the book, Robert recounts the commissioning of Dr. Gerald to write the official history at the height of Fitz's power. "I mean, we will have our epic written as it should be," he said. "Tomorrow, no, tonight, I will send for historians, poets. We will set the record straight on all we've done. They will tell the history as we want it told. No one will ever know." "Know what?" I said. "See, you have already forgotten," he said, and disappeared among his Uzbeki guardsmen in the garden. Soon thereafter, on December 20th, we at Neapolis gained the company of Dr. Jonathan Gerald, the poetess Miss Mary Ann Collins, and their sizable respective staffs. It's only at this point, nearing the end of the book, that we learn that Gerald, the authority cited repeatedly throughout the text, was a straight-up propagandist, which doesn't validate Robert Bruce's account. It only gives us two conflicting sources with no way to determine for certain whether each is accurate, biased, or outright false. It's why seemingly simple historical questions can be argued for centuries. In a work of fiction, it's one of the best uses of unreliable narration I've read. Fitz holds his plans close, giving his associates only the information they need to do their work. Robert is sent to India to manage the building of airfields. He doesn't know the big picture, only his piece of the plan. And through this, Charlotte is working on him, trying to fan the flames of conscience and compassion in him. The portrayal of the war itself is a bit lackluster in this book, but again, it's that unreliable narration at work. The massive Chinese armies keep throwing themselves against impregnable defenses and human wave attacks. They're often presented as unimaginative, slow to learn from mistakes, as merely a horde of baddies that are in the way of Yukon expansion. But it makes sense in the context of this book. Remember that it's framed as a memoir written by a man who is steeped in the mythos of his people, even as he doesn't always agree with it. His are God's chosen. The foreign heathens are meant to fall before them, even if they at times put up a valiant fight. It's after the war, with Fitz standing like a colossus astride the world, that Robert is torn apart by his split loyalties. Fitz has become not merely a tyrant, but an unstable tyrant, consumed by his own legend. Chasing the ghost of Alexander the Great, he builds a new capital for his empire. He surrounds himself with sycophants and scheming hangers-on, waiting for their own opportunity to seize power, sliding into paranoia. Much earlier in the book, Fitz asks Robert if King David was a good man. They have a discussion about David's many crimes and shortcomings, but finally agreeing that, all that aside, he was God's beloved. And that leads to a moment that Robert recognizes as one of the pivotal decisions of his life and quite possibly the world. "Robert," he murmured, "do you believe God will love me as he loved David? I would today give up my soul if I could go back to that moment and tell Fitz he could still turn back from his awful destiny. I could have spoken the truth to him in that moment, and my career and even my life might have been ended by my words." There was also the unexplored possibility that Fitz might have grabbed onto the truth as a drowning man grasps for a lifeline. The loss of my life would have been the loss of one man. What could that matter when placed against entire nations Fitz was preparing to rain fire upon? I might have saved hundreds of millions of lives with those few honest words. But instead he told his friend what he wanted to hear, and in so doing gave him absolution. I don't want to give everything away, and there are plenty of surprises left, but this last bit ties the whole historical commentary together. The book early on reveals that the Timermen can control the storm machines. They built them, but only gradually does it come through that they also have a long-term plan within a cyclical model of history with stages of rise and decline. The Yukons are in the heroic stage, but Fitz has just brought them to the beginnings of empire, which inevitably leads to decadence, weakness, and collapse. The Timermen work to keep the Yukon Confederacy in that heroic stage indefinitely. They find it easy with the commoners, even more so with the criminals and drudges, but the upper classes are more difficult. They give us all our headaches. Wealth and power ruin the best of them after a time. They have to be skimmed off every so often like cream from milk. No, that's an inappropriate metaphor. He fell silent for a few seconds and fingered his duck's head cane as he thought. Like extracting poison from a wound, he said. The Timermen have quite surgically brought down the budding decadence, but left a key remnant to abuse power so systematically and so thoroughly that the people will smash them and reinstate the old Yukon system of government and law with a renewed sense of vigor behind it. The idea of a semi-secret society directing the course of human events isn't a new one. The Timermen have some similarities to Dune's Bene Gesserit, the Foundation, and of course parallels with various Illuminati speculations and whatnot. But this instance is particularly good at illustrating the disconnect between the idea of history working in cycles and a cabal of puppeteers that are somehow outside the cycle and immune from the forces shaping the rest of civilization. Whatever the case, the Timermen, like all technocrats, have their vision of the world as it should be, and they will see that it runs according to spec. Individual people are merely variables in a complex equation, and so long as it balances in the end, well, some variables do have to be canceled out. Enforce stagnation in the name of stability. Carefully crafted wars in the name of long-term peace. And yet, Dr. Murray offers Robert a justification that has more than a little truth in it. If we had let you be born into an electronic world, you, Sir Robert, would be a humble non-entity doing meaningless work in an office containing 100 other drudges doing similarly meaningless labor. You would be pushed around in small ways by everyone in authority, married to a man-hating shrew, afraid of being attacked on the streets and insulted by everything you saw, read, or heard. Instead, look at you. A double knight, a hero, the lover of a woman who adores you, an actor in an epic chapter of history. You are Sir Brigadier General Robert Mayfair Bruce, and not a frightened, harassed nobody. Be happy in the life we have given you, sir, and farewell in this heroic world. The Yukon Confederacy has its drudge work too, but as depicted throughout, none of it is quite as detached from the living world as staring at a screen under fluorescent lights all day. It doesn't require anything as drastic as the collapse of modern society to ameliorate the worst of that. There's a lot I didn't cover here. Layers of the world building from politics to technology, several interesting characters that are worthy of note. It's not a perfect book, but it deserves much more recognition than it gets. If any of this sounds interesting, I definitely recommend giving Fitzpatrick's War a look, though I must add that it's become a bit difficult to find, and when you do, it's rather expensive. On the upside, it is available for free at archive.org, though it's not the optimal format for reading it. If I ever run across it in a used bookstore at a reasonable price, I'm definitely going to grab it. If nothing else, the book reminds us that some people just need a proper cappuccino from time to time.